taping? I need a hand mic, actually. Test. Good evening. Well, I would be remiss as an alumnus of the University of Kansas, not to mention the fact that the Jayhawks are the national champions 2022. Had to wear the colors. Thank you, thank you. Welcome to this space and time so that we can join together in learning. And I see many faces that have been here previously, but in case anybody doesn't know me, I'm John Wachter. I'm a member of this congregation here, thank you, Traverse City Presbyterian Church. I'm also a member of the Mission Committee and the Racial Justice Task Force, which is the task force that had put together this series of speakers for Lent. The sessions are being recorded. They are also available by Zoom. I know we have some people Zooming in tonight, I believe, but they will be posted on the church website as well. So if you have missed a previous one and would like to see that, you can go back and see that on the church website. The Racial Justice Working Group established as one of its priorities in 2022 the following statement: reckon with the missional and colonial history of this land, specifically Presbyterian's role, and work to build a relationship with the Native American community. At this time of Lent, we begin that effort in earnest, to reckon with the past. And to that end, we have brought this series of speakers to Wednesday Night Connection. And we've entitled the series Place, the Land, the Church, and the People Where We Live. Week one, we had Tom Deluge, who's joined us with some friends again tonight. Thank you for coming, Tom, who spoke about Peter Doherty and the Doherty House, the early Presbyterian missionary of the region. Week two was Mark Wilson, Tribal Vice Chair of the Tribal Council for the Grand Traverse Band, and also a city commissioner in Traverse City. Week three was the Reverend Lucy Wachter-Webb, who spoke to us about the doctrine of discovery, and especially the Presbyterian Church's involvement in the colonization of the land. And this week, week four, we welcome Eric Hemingway. We'll hear more about Eric in formal introduction, but he is the director of the Department of Repatriation, Archives, and Records of the Little Traverse Band of Ottawa Indians. And he's going to speak to us about the boarding schools that were operated in this region. So those of you who have been here previously, be patient with me because I'm going to repeat something again. And that's about reckoning with the past. The first part of that is to examine events in the context of who wrote the history. And in the introductory text of the Our Peoples exhibit, the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian in DC, the curators drew a distinction between the past and history. They wrote, "The past never changes, but the way we understand it, learn about it, changes all the time." It's not the goal of this series to pit one history, written or oral, against another history by one group, but we do need to recognize that the history that becomes predominant is affected by power. And often the people who are the holders of power have shaped history in a certain way for their own purposes. The Our Peoples exhibit speaks to this. It speaks to it in a way that counters the popular narratives of defeat and disappearance of indigenous people, and instead they chronicle the people's survival. And they aptly describe it as one of the most extraordinary stories of resilience in human history. George Erasmus, who was an Aboriginal leader, Aboriginal leader from Canada, said, quote, "Where common memory is lacking, where people do not share the same history, there can be no real community." In that spirit, at this time of Lent, we pray that the work we do here in this series may be confessional in nature, because we recognize racism at its root as a spiritual problem. If you're not a member of the Racial Justice Working Group, you're certainly welcome to join that team. You'll hear more about this later from Lucy. Part of a future call to action in this church will be 2 presentations about how PCUSA makes policy. It's called We're Stronger Together. And this is going to be April 24th, immediately following worship, and May 1st, immediately following worship. The second one will be focusing on racial justice, a chance to examine some of the overtures which will be presented to the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church this summer, one in particular about murdered and Indigenous women and girls, which is one I hope that we can endorse to the commissioners. With that, I'd like to ask Rachel to come forward, who will share the land acknowledgement.
This is a land acknowledgement written by Reverend Lucy Walker-Webb. As we gather tonight, sitting on this particular patch of land, we remember that the land has a history, a present, and a future. Long ago, before any brick was laid or concrete poured, there was likely a tree standing right where each of our feet rest now. Here, it was likely a white pine, a red pine, or a hemlock. This land was covered with the forest, which was home to so much life before the trees were clear-cut in just a short span of a few decades. The trees here were called green gold by the lumber barons. As the trees came down at the hands of the white communities who settled on the land, the people native to this place had their land stolen and experienced ethnic cleansing and genocide. Tonight, we gather on the ancestral lands and unceded territory of the Anishinaabe peoples. This land was stolen by a people who thought ownership of the sacred earth was theirs to take. In 1839, Peter Dougherty, a Presbyterian minister, was sent to the area by the Presbyterian Board of Foreign Mission to establish a church and a school here. It was the establishment of this mission alongside the development of white settler communities in the area that in part grew the wealth for this church. Our land access, this building, the endowment, and our power locally all grew out of this history at the expense of Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous life. And as a Presbyterian, I acknowledge and confess the harms of my spiritual ancestors for the violence that occurred in the name of our spiritual tradition as the first Christian mission in the region where I reside. Many of these truths about the past we are still learning and recovering. We offer deep gratitude and respect for the elders past and present of the Three Fires Confederacy, the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi peoples who call Turtle Island home. We give thanks for their stewardship of the land, for protecting the water, for remembering we are all part of this great home we also call Earth. We offer our gratitude today for the ways they continue to lead us toward right relationship with the earth and with each other. And we give thanks for the ways they continue to teach us and lead us toward collective liberation.
Good evening. My name is Lucy Walker-Webb. If I have not met you yet, it's good to see you here tonight. I'm really excited about this week in particular. I heard Eric speak just before everything shut down for the pandemic, and I'm really excited to reconnect and bring him into relationship with this community and the conversation that we've been having. We're going to do a quick somatic practice to ground us as we enter this space together tonight, and then I'll offer a brief intro, and the floor will be Eric's. So as we have talked about throughout the process, much of what we learn and recover and be in touch with about the history that we have been examining is incredibly hard to hold and to encounter, and can bring up all kinds of things for us. And one of the important things that we tend to along the way is to ensure that we are able to connect with our own body for the sake of staying in the room, for staying in the work, and for being able to encounter and be with these hard, uncomfortable truths. White supremacy culture would have us disconnect and divest from our bodies. And we are, in fact, quite practiced at that. And so part of this work is to recover the history, be in right relationship, and also to connect and be in right relationship with our own bodies again, so we can continue to build a different future together and move through the hard things together. So we've been sort of weaving some of those practices throughout, and I'd like to start with one tonight. And this practice is simply orienting to positive resource, which helps us to be resilient in the face of difficult things, and again, helps us to remember that we have bodies and to come back into our body when we feel like we might be checking out, tuning out, like it may be hard to stay with the hard emotion in particular. And I want to just also acknowledge that we all have very well-developed, intelligent nervous systems that have helped us to survive, right? And have helped our ancestors to survive. And so I also want to say, as we enter any somatic practice, that you know your body better than anyone else. And there may be a moment where you need to be in choice and consent around what you engage with in a practice like this. And know that that is your choice, and that you have full agency over your own body to make those kinds of choices. Because what we do know is if we push ourselves into unsafe space for too long and too far, we will burn out and eventually not be in the work at all anymore, right? So there's a zone here that we are trying to grow our capacity for. And I want to remind you to listen to your own body and to pay attention to what it is asking you to do, which is in and of itself an embodied somatic practice. So with that said, this practice is called Orienting to Positive Resource. And one of the quickest ways to get into our bodies is to do that through the sensations, through the senses of our bodies: taste, sight, smell, touch, and hearing. And so you can do this practice with your eyes closed. We will eventually bring in sight. If it helps you to tune into the other four senses first to close your eyes, you may do that. You can also leave your eyes open if that feels more available and intriguing to you as we start this practice. And as we move toward those five senses in just a moment, I invite you to start again with just acknowledging and reading your breath again in this moment. not needing to change it or adjust it in any way, but just finding it, breathing it, and feeling the rise and fall of your own breath. And feeling for the support that is underneath you and behind you in this moment. The floor, the chair, the couch, and of course the earth itself. And from that place of center and groundedness, I invite you to begin by orienting toward your sense of hearing. And there may be things that you hear that are maybe unpleasant or a little grating, but there also may be things that you hear that are supportive or even just neutral, maybe a little bit pleasing or a little bit better than neutral. See if you can attune your attention to that. Maybe your own breathing. Maybe the breathing of the person next to you. Maybe my voice. Or maybe even your phone buzzing. And then I invite you to move to the sense of taste. And again, see if you can locate anything that is either pleasant or pleasing or even just neutral. Many of you may have just eaten. You may have access to the taste of what you have just eaten or had a drink. Even in the midst of the chaos of the world, the access to the neutrality and the pleasing aspects of these senses are available to us. So even when sound breaks in, or a difficult thing breaks in, see if you can still locate the neutral or the little bit better than neutral taste or sound. And then move to your sense of smell and see if you can just observe what is available to you in your smell. Anything that might be neutral or a little bit better than neutral. And then moving to your sense of touch. What can you feel that is either neutral or pleasing? Perhaps the softness of a piece of clothing, or the firmness of the floor. Maybe it can be cool air or warm air. And if you've had your eyes closed, I invite you to bring your hands to your chest and just rub them together a little bit in like a prayer posture and warm them up a little bit. And then you can cup them over your eyes and just feel the energy and warmth of your hands nourishing the front of your face and your brain and all that it holds. And then slowly begin to orient your eyes back to the light, into the darkness of your hands first, and allowing your eyes to slowly transition to little bits of light as they come in, and taking your hands down when you're ready. Letting your body tell you when your eyes are ready to receive a little bit more light. And then as you look around, again, I invite you to orient in this room. It could be behind you, above you, next to you, beneath you, to just slowly scan the room and orient to what you are sitting, standing amongst. And allow your eyes to guide you. So let your eyes be drawn to the things that are pleasing or neutral, and allow yourself to just dwell there for a little bit and to take in the resource of that pleasing thing. Acknowledging that these supports are accessible to us all the time, no matter where we are, and that they speak to the resilience of this earth and of our bodies and our peoples. I invite you to continue to just hold that practice in the back of your head and in the tissues of your body as you sit here tonight and hear from Eric, knowing that if your body begins to feel the tension or the pressure or the fear, the anxiety or the rage or the whatever may come up for you, that even just toggling back to something that is resourcing for you can help you reground, recenter, and reconnect to the work at hand. And of course, I invite you, as always, to take the practice with you as it serves you. Thank you for being vulnerable and showing up in this space these last 4 weeks and being willing to connect and reconnect to our bodies, which are so often unavailable to most of us, many of us, but also have been specifically told by the church that we should not be paying attention to them, right? Or that we should be articulating only one way, one certain kind, one right body, and supporting that one right body in the world. And so it's risky to reconnect to our bodies. And I thank you for doing this with me. I'm going to introduce Eric and then invite him to do some sharing. Eric is an Anishinaabe man who lives and came down from Harbor Springs to be with us tonight. I met him at Doing Our Own Work conference training that is part of Allies for Change downstate, and has done work statewide and has sort of since transitioned in their organizational structure. But met him at Niatwanta Inn doing work with a bunch of other white folks who were involved in just like it says, doing our own work around what we need to do to continue to dismantle white supremacy. And Eric speaks to many groups just like that, to schools. He said he's spoken to some churches as well, and is the director of archives at Cross Village, and is doing a lot of work regionally, locally. Many people, when I ask who's doing this kind of work, say his name, to specifically recover and work toward, what is needed for repair around the history of the Indian boarding schools that the church and the government were, of course, both complicit in running and building. I think that's all I have to offer. Do you have any personal details you want me? You can share. Any other family or hobbies or likes that we to remind us of what you do when you're not studying really hard things and speaking about really hard things. So thank you for being with us tonight. I'm really excited for how this conversation is going to continue to carry us forward as a congregation as we reckon with our own history here. So thanks for being here.
To be in front of people. of screens and little boxes and faces in the boxes, and the box goes blank and you see a name and you don't know what they're doing, and you hear dogs and kids and everything else. So it's really nice to be in front of living people. So I say thank you, miigwech. It's thank you in the native language. But first, before I get started, let's give a traditional introduction. It kind of helps center me where I want to go with my talk and keep me grounded. Ganabik and Disnakas, Anamatikamekh, Donjibab, Ishnabe, Odawa, Endau, and Jijik Dodam, Jinage Archive and Records for the Waganaks and Odawak, Uchi and Mod. Mic's not working. Go up higher. How about that? A little louder. How about that? I'll just hold it. That's okay. I'll start all over. Ganabik and Disnakas, Anamatikamekh and Donjaba, Anishinaabe, Odawa, Endau, and Jijik Dodam, Jinage Archives and Records for the Waganaks and Odawak, and Gitchin, Mabagishigat, Maba Dibakak, Tamada Oki, and Junaki and Minwa, Bamadabizi, when miigwech. So I'm trying to learn my native language, which kind of really ties into our talk tonight. And it's been a slow, tough process to learn my native language of Anishinaabemowin. I did not grow up with the language. It was not spoken in my house. And that was really by design. And so going through the last, I'd say 30 years and trying to piece together the language is an ongoing duty, I feel. And it's something that a lot of people throughout Turtle Island are doing, is reclaiming their indigenous languages, the Anishinaabe and Michigan included. So tonight I just give a simple introduction. One of my names is the snake, Ganabik and Disnakas, and I self-identify as Anishinaabe Odawa. I am Anishinaabe, and I am from the place of the prayer tree, aka Cross Village, and that's between Harbor Springs and Mackinac City on the shores of Lake Michigan. And I am of the Crane clan, so within the Anishinaabe world we have extended families. Bear Clan, Eagle, Turtle. I am Crane Clan, and I'm the Director of Archives and Records for the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa Indians, located up in Harbor Springs, Emmett County, and I'm very happy to be here tonight to share my work in my life, because I'm pretty much enmeshed at this point, and I just want to say thank you again for having me. So this is, without a doubt, for me personally, the toughest subject I deal with in terms of history, and also for personal storytelling, is the boarding schools. I grew up in Cross Village, 45, soon to be 46, and I grew up in Cross Village and I went to school in Harbor Springs, so I'm a very local person. And growing up in a very typical Odawa family, which means grandma, uncle, mom, sister, aunt, sometimes no aunt, cousins, dogs. I mean, we had a lot going on in our home at all times. It was a living, breathing thing, and I loved it. It was just awesome to have so much life in the home. And so it wasn't just my home, but I jumped around to a lot of different homes. I have like 5 families, and that's very fortunate for that. And so growing up in an Odawa community, but also a non-native community as well, I had a lot of non-native friends, and in this community, there was always this knowledge and awareness of the boarding school, even in the non-native community, because we had one of these schools in Harbor Springs. And it was one of the last boarding schools to close in the country in 1983. And the building was torn down in 2007. So it was the largest building in Harbor Springs. You couldn't miss it. Large red brick building, 3 stories, right next to the Holy Child of Jesus Church. So if you've ever been to Harbor Springs, you know it just descends down the hill and everything leads towards the church. And adjacent to the church for over 100 years was this boarding school. So you knew it, even if you didn't know it. If you went downtown, if you drove past it, there's this really large brick building. So you just knew it as a landmark. And growing up in the community, growing up in this Odawa family, we got this different perspective of it, because a lot of it wasn't taught in school. Matter of fact, going through the public school system, we never talked about it once in all my years of going to public school in Harbor Springs. It was never mentioned, but at home, it was mentioned for sure. My I'm gonna tell you that's where the Indian boarding school was. He was a young lad. I'm like, well, what's this boarding school? She goes, that's where they made you be non-Indian, essentially. But she wouldn't tell me the whole story, of course, because I'm a child, and you get pieces as you grow and you learn, and you can accept what this truth is. So as I got older, the more the story came out of what the boarding school was. There was this place of forced assimilation. It was a place where just the Indian kids went. And then I learned that it wasn't just Indian kids at times. There was a lot of white kids that went there as day students, and it really took me back. So, but the kids that went there and lived there as boarders were always native. It was an Indian boarding school. And we would hear stories about the school, that these kids did not have the best experiences, and they were often mistreated, they were abused, and this is something I tread very lightly on, because I know a lot of people, not a lot, but I know a few people who went to the boarding school and they're still alive to this day. So the anomaly with Holy Childhood is that it closed so late that we have a lot of people in our community who are still with us in their 50s and 60s and 70s. So this is something I tread lightly on. I'm not here to represent their story. I'm not here to represent them at all. I'm trying to not represent anything or anyone, but tell you what the school was. And growing up as a Native person, how it impacted me who didn't go to the school. Not speaking my language. My great-grandfather went to a boarding school, so that's where the language ended in my family lineage. And going through these records recently, I see where my great-uncle, or my great-aunt married, so he was my uncle, Titus Astinaway. He was on this roll for the Mount Pleasant Indian boarding school. And I would have never known that Uncle Ty, who I remember very vaguely. He was quite elderly when I was quite young, but I remember him. I remember going to my Aunt Gladys's house in Charlevoix, and her and Titus were there, and they're just like it's his family. You went and seen Uncle Ty and Aunt Gladys. And never knowing, he went to this school and what his experiences were. Never said anything, nobody said nothing, but I found this out doing the research recently, and there he was, a 10-year-old boy going to this school. So this reverberates through all Native communities. Even if you didn't go to the school, somebody in your family went to the school at some point. Or things were taken out of your community, like language, customs, traditions, religion, spirituality. And so as I got into this position of being a quote-unquote professional historian, I get paid to do history now. I've been at my job for 16 years. But I consider myself a lifelong historian, collecting stories, listening to people, being in places. And as one elder would always say, you have 2 ears and 2 eyes. And I'm like, yep. And they have 1 mouth. I'm like, yep. And they're like, therefore, you should be listening and speaking twice as much as you're talking. And that really stuck out to me as a young lad. They're saying, pay attention. And so I consider myself a lifelong historian of just being around people, listening and watching. And that school was always part of this attention. This large building was there. And then starting to learn more about what this was. And when I first started my career as a historian, I tended to shy away from it. It's one of these subjects I didn't want to get into too fast. I knew it was hard, it was tough, and it was so recent. I could go and talk to people who went there. I could literally feel that energy of the school still. So I kind of steered my studies and my research and my energies in different directions for a while. But inevitably, it came back to this. It had to. And when it did, it was all-consuming, I should say. It's like, this is what I've been doing for the last 2 to 3 years in great detail. Right before the pandemic hit, is research into the boarding school. And I'll get into why in a little bit. But before I started to get into the nitty-gritty details of Holy Childhood, I wanted to figure out what created the system. That's something that's really important to me, that this school just didn't pop up out of nowhere. There's a system that made the school. So I started with that first. And it goes back hundreds of years. And it goes back to when Columbus landed in 1492. He came to this continent and he's seen these indigenous people and immediately labeled them as savages. And that they're uncivilized and that they're heathens and pagans. And it's the duty of these Christian nations to bring them into a civilized state. So that's where it really starts, is seeing Native people as savage. And if they don't convert, then a lot of times they're destroyed. So it wasn't just Columbus, it was the Dutch, it was the Spanish, it was the French, it was the British, and then lastly it was the Americans. Through centuries, they would come onto these shores and go into these indigenous communities who were vast and unique and different, but they always had the same mindset. They're not equal, they're savage. And it wasn't just one or two individuals saying this, it was religious leaders, it was school teachers, it was government officials, it was presidents, it was congressmen, from the top down and bottom up. Everybody saw Native people as savage. You could sympathize and say, yes, they're men and women, but they're still savage. And there was this divine right that said, we have to bring them into a civilized state. So this really permeated all of interactions with Native people, legally, socially, religiously, for hundreds of years in this country. But it wasn't the Americans first. It was, like I said, the Dutch, it was the French, it was the British. They were all seeing Native people as less than and as savage. So that's, in my mind, the origin of these schools, is this idea of forced change. That what you're doing is wrong, what you're doing is heathen, what you're doing is pagan, devil worship. And this is all through the records, through multiple sources, through multiple generations, multiple centuries of this rhetoric, and oftentimes propaganda towards Native people, demonizing them, making them less than human. And then once they are in this category, I think it makes it much easier to subjugate them to these policies. But then the reality of the time is also we're here to help them. We're bringing them from this, degraded, uncivilized state to a state of grace and civilization. Who wouldn't want that? So there was this attitude that we're doing the right thing for you, even though it's going to be tough. And this, I said, goes through everything towards Native people: your appearance, your housing, your government, how you raise your children, your education, how you interact with land, education, your belief, your worship, your language. All of this was targeted for change. And as America grew, the policies grew with it. And these are called civilization policies, and they started really in 1776. If you look into the Constitution, Natives are only mentioned twice, once in commerce and trade, and then once against the grievances against King George, where the Constitution is citing that King George is supposedly inciting the merciless Indian savages on the frontier, whose only known mode of warfare is complete destruction, regardless of race and gender. So it's in the Constitution that we are bloodthirsty savages. And that is our foundational document. So if people are using this as the foundation and they go forward to interact with these other populations, how are they going to react? Usually not favorably. So this builds over generations and time, the idea of the savage. And it comes to this point in time where natives are, every tribe has had war with the United States. It's not one or two wars, from Maine to California, everywhere in between. So it's not like tribes just said, okay, we want this to happen. We're gonna, be idle and, passive. They fought back for land, for resources, for everything. So after the wars were settled, the United States had more of an opportunity to subjugate. And so they were going through the landscape and what we call Indian country. And Indian country is everything that has to do with anything native. It can be politics, land, people, anything. So they're surveying Indian country, and this is by the late 1800s, and it was determined that they're still savage. And I get this information from Library of Congress, the National Archives, the state archives. I don't have a secret vault in my office where I can pull things out or a crystal ball. It's stuff that's public domain. You just got to sit down and read it. And as my mentor would tell me, you got to read it, but then you got to also build in the time to, decompress, because you're going to read things that are wildly offensive, they're racist, they're misogynist, but this is the time. It reflects what people were thinking. It reflects, snippets. But you have to power through it, because when I first started doing the work, I would shut down. I'd get so angry and so just raging, like these people don't have any clue. And this is the President of the United States. This is George Washington, and he had the name Town Destroyer. because during the Revolutionary War, he would go through and burn and raze Iroquois villages in New York and push them off their land. And he would go a step further and put salt in the earth so you couldn't grow crops. So this is someone who's revered as like the founding father, but then on the flip side, he's doing this with Native people, and Thomas Jefferson and Samuel Adams and all these other, quote unquote heroes. But they had this other side to them when it comes to Native individuals, that they all saw us as savage, every single one of them. And it was their duty to change us. So by taking land, by removing people, by pushing them off their resources, and then finally, like I said, in the late 1800s, wasn't working enough. So what's the solution? Children. You go into homes and communities and you take the children from the communities and raise them outside of that culture, language, tradition, heritage. They won't grow up savage. So in the late 1800s, the official Indian boarding school system was created. Now, there's always been schools that Native children went to. They were called mission schools. And this is not to be confused with the Indian boarding school. Mission schools were a joint cooperation between Native communities who wanted them in their community. We had these in Harbor Springs. There was a mission school at Holy Childhood. There was Catholic Odawas, still are to this day. And they said, we wanted this in our community. It's a joint operation. But then all the quote unquote pagans said, no, we don't want this. And they would protest and push back against such schools and churches. But by the by 1840s, 50s, especially 1830s, there was bigger problems. That's Indian removal. That they were moving out tens of thousands of Native people to west of the Mississippi. And we were targeted for removal here in northern Michigan in 1838. Said, we're going to move you to Kansas. And so they sent scouts to Kansas, and they came back and said, no, we're not going to Kansas. No offense to anybody from Kansas in here, but it's not Michigan. Oh, we got to Kansas. The first thing they said when they came back is, there's no water. Where's the Great Lakes? Where's our trees? We have to be by our home, in our home, with our home. So they pushed back and said, we're not leaving. And part of that strategy in my mind is inviting churches and these schools and assimilating so they could stay home. But that wasn't enough. And so by the late 1800s, the system was created of the Indian boarding school, and it was founded by an individual largely credited for this as Richard Pratt. He was an Indian fighter, he was in the army, and he was experimenting with prisoners of war in Florida. And there were some Seminoles and Apaches and other individuals from the West that were at his camp in Florida. And he devised this system. If you can just keep them away from their communities, you keep them indoctrinated in these institutions, then they'll become civilized. And the younger, the better. So he was experimenting on these POWs essentially. And he got the funding, he got the go-ahead from Congress and the president to create these schools. And you start getting federal funding, you know it's a real thing. So there was actual line items in federal budgets for boarding schools for over 100 years. They're funding these schools all over the country. And as far as I know at this point, there was over 360 schools across the country. It wasn't a dozen or 100, 360 from Alaska all through the continental US. I don't know if there's schools in Hawaii, I'm not quite sure. But I know for a fact there was a lot of schools in Alaska, and they ran late too. So there's 360 of these schools. They're usually near Native populations, or they were separated from Native populations like Carlisle. And there's reasons for this. So once these schools were created, these kids were going in. It's very complicated. I haven't figured out how all these kids got to these schools. It's just, there's too many nuances and moving parts to it. So I know some kids went to the school because it was expected that you went because it's an Indian school. And I was doing some research recently into this whole legacy of schools, and I stumbled across this brochure. It was from the trains of the 1870s and 1880s that ran from Grand Rapids to Petoskey. And so they're advertising fresh air, clean water, the drudgery of the cities, and then they had a section on Holy Childhood, the boarding school. This is odd because it was such a fixture in the community, everybody knew it. So when you're being put into these brochures for tourism, that just shows the impact that this institution had outside of your Native community. So I'm reading through it, and something really telling was in this tourist brochure, and in it, it said, Holy Childhood is one of 2 Indian schools in the state. And the Indian kids go to this school because they're not welcomed anywhere else. So, piece of the puzzle is put in. And going through some of this other research and looking at graduation rates at local schools in Emmett County, very, very low. Like the school I went to, Harbor Springs, through the early 20th century, maybe 1 or 2 Odawas were graduating out of a class of 40, 30. Petoskey, the largest town in Emmett County, was even less, maybe 1 or 2 out of 50, 60. But during that same exact time period, 1910, 1915, there's 100 kids at Holy Childhood. There's 150 kids at Mount Pleasant. There's 30 kids down at Carlisle. Everybody was at the boarding school. How they got there is complicated. There's social pressure to go there. Obviously, there's systemic racism saying that they're not welcome at the public schools. They come to find out that Harbor Springs, when it was first, the addition was put onto the high school in 1918, they had a $25 fee to go to the school in 1918. That was huge money. Who had $25 in 1918? Not many Odawas did, I don't think. Then also, there was this expectation that you went to the school. Your father went there, your grandfather went there, you went there. It was just what you did. Then there's also social services. So hearing stories about people going to the boarding school and social services would come in play, like the 40s and 50s. And there would be reports of neglect at a Native family, and the social worker would come in. And sometimes they wouldn't even come in. The police would just come in and say, we're taking your kids and they're going to go to the school. That's that. So how the kids arrived at the school is a lot of different avenues, a lot of different ways, but the fact remains that the school was there. These kids were going to these schools. And like I said, we had, that I know of right now, 4 schools in Michigan. One was at Harbor Springs, the Holy Child of Jesus, the Mount Pleasant Industrial School in Mount Pleasant that closed, I believe, in 1934. There was a school down by Kalamazoo and St. Joseph. I'm not quite sure the closing date. And then there was a school up in Baraga, Bonds. Keweenaw Bay. So we had 4 schools, and I think the Baraga school closed in the 1950s, late 40s, early 50s. But Native kids from Michigan weren't regulated to just going to the schools in Michigan. In our community in northern Michigan, there was kids that went to Carlisle, Pennsylvania. There was kids that went to Genoa, Nebraska. There was kids that went to Haskell, Kansas. There was kids that went to Chilote, Oklahoma. All over. I don't know how they ended up at these schools. That's part of my research I still have to complete. How did a kid from Cross Village end up in Nebraska? How did a kid from Petoskey end up in Mount Pleasant? I don't know. And some kids went to multiple schools. They went to Holy Childhood, then they went to Mount Pleasant, they went to Mount Pleasant, then they went to Carlisle. So there's a lot to unpackage with just the day-to-day details of the school. And some kids didn't have bad experiences. And that was really surprising for me to hear when I started to talk to people. Some said, yeah, it was fine. I didn't experience anything bad. I had actually a decent time. Okay, that's I can't argue your experience. Then I talked to another person who went to the school at the exact same time and said it was the worst thing I ever had in my life. Absolutely devastating. Can't even talk about it. These 2 people were at the same school at the same time, had completely opposite experiences. So it'd be remiss of me as a historian to say it's one way or the other. It's not that simple. But then when I get into these complex situations, I go back, why is the system even there? Because if one kid's being abused, that's one too many, right? You have thousands that are going through these schools, hundreds, if not thousands, are being neglected and abused. The system, I always come back to that. Why is this school even created? It was to make us not native, to quote unquote civilize us. So take your religion, your spirituality, your language, your community ties, your family ties. you sever them, and you keep these kids at the schools as long as possible to have the higher chance of success for civilization. And from the records I've seen personally, kids at Holy Childhood were as young as 4 years old when they attended. And some of these kids would start there at 6, 7, 8, 9, it just depends. They were very young at times. Some kids would stay for 6, 7 years. Some kids would stay for a year. Some kids would go as day students where they would go home at night. Some would live there. All depended on the individual. So Holy Childhood was run by the Catholic Church for its entire career. And the Franciscan Friars and the Sisters of Notre Dame are the two who ran it. So it was a Catholic school, and some of these schools were not run by denominations, but many were, because at the time, you couldn't be civilized and be non-Christian. It just did not compute. To be civilized, you had to be Christian. So whether it was a Methodist school, a Catholic school, a government school, they all had the same idea of change of the individual. So ours was Catholic. And I think the school up in Baraga was Catholic, and there's a lot of other Catholic schools across the country as well. But these Catholic communities have been in place for hundreds of years by this point. The Jesuits, and so it wasn't far-fetched for the Catholics or any other denomination to step in, receive federal funding. Now they're a boarding school. It fit their operation, their mission. So the school up in Harbor Springs, it ran all the way until 1983. Carlisle closed in 1918, I believe. The largest, most prolific school, doors shut. After that, most of the other schools started to shut down, largely due to funding. But then a large report came out called the Miriam Report, and it was a government report looking at Indian education and said, this isn't working. Taking these kids and bringing them out of their homes, and the conditions at these schools are horrible. They can go to the public schools. That'll suffice. So a lot of these schools started to shut down, but not all of them. A lot of schools went into the 30s, 40s, 50s. Then there was Holy Childhood. It stopped receiving federal funding, I believe, late 1920s, early 1930s. But it went through and would do its own fundraising for the next 50 years to keep its doors open. So it's an anomaly in a lot of senses. It's not like other schools that it ran so long. And again, I tread very lightly because I know people who went there and they didn't have the best experiences. I want to respect their lives, their experience. One individual who gave me permission to share a little bit of her story talked about how she got there, where the social services came in and they made the call right on the spot to take her and her siblings, and they went to the school, and she stayed there for like 6 years. And she's seen a lot, and it wasn't always good. Actually, a lot of it was quite negative, abuse and neglect, and not just physical abuse, but mental and emotional. Kids weren't allowed to see their families, or they had visitations revoked, or there was being locked in rooms and just beatings on a consistent basis. And this was ongoing all the time. So I imagine even if you didn't experience that, you were witnessing it with your classmates. It had to impact you in some way or form. So I didn't go to school. I was too young. And my mom didn't go. And I don't think my grandma went, but my great-grandfather did. I found him unpleasant. And put my pieces of my family together, knowing my grandma was born in a logging camp in Mansalona, middle of nowhere. Maybe there was a reason for that. She wouldn't have to go to the school. They're keeping her out there. So Eli Paul knew something that a lot of us didn't know back then. Keep his daughter out of that system. So I'm pretty far removed in my own family tree of it, but again, I don't speak my language fluently. I don't have a lot of the stories and traditions that other individuals and communities have. But we're reclaiming them as we speak. If natives are anything, they're resilient. They're not going to be defined by this really dark piece of history, these really horrible, horrible part of our story of the United States. You know, we're moving kids and breaking apart families, and these kids are suffering at these schools. And this really broke on a national scene last year. We've known about this in our communities for a long time. But then last year, up in Canada, they have the same exact system. It's called a residential school. It's the same thing. And they started to find discoveries at these schools. And in one school, I don't know how it came about. They were doing some type of archaeological survey or something, but they found over 200 kids buried around one school. Then they went to the next school and they found 180. They went to the next school and they found 750 kids around one school. And considering that Native people only make up 1% of the population in the United States, you do the math. It's devastating. One school, 750 kids. That's an entire generation gone. They have over 200 schools. So they're still doing the work. They're still finding mass burials. But then we have to look back in our own backyard. We had 360 of these schools. Same scenarios. Kids buried around schools. In Carlisle, the cemetery is very well known at Carlisle, the kids that pass there. And recently the communities from the plains, I believe the Lakota, they're going back and repatriating, taking back their kids, their children, reburying them back on their homelands. A real powerful move by that tribe, and really moving to see a large part of that repatriation was young people. They were coming in and saying, we're going to bring these kids back. It's really, you can look it up. It's a really moving story that they're bringing them back home. But there's other schools out there that we just don't know. And the Secretary of Interior was actually a Native woman, Deb Holland. She issued an investigation into this last June. Saying we're going to investigate the Indian boarding schools in the United States. Where are the burials? How many kids went to these schools? Who went there? This is a watershed moment for tribes. That they're going to look and try to find some answers. It's wildly complex and complicated, but at least there is word coming from the top. The Secretary of Interior says, we're going to look at this. And we don't have to look very far in Michigan. We have that here. It's not Pennsylvania or Kansas or Oklahoma. It's Harbor Springs. It's Mount Pleasant. It's right in our own backyards. So it's coming, it's happening. And like I said, I don't want to dwell too much on the negative experiences of individuals because that's not my story to tell. They're there if you want to look for them. They're absolutely horrific to hear kids going through this. And we did things happen. Last year I was at my desk working and had this email from this individual said they were from NBC News. I'm like, yeah, right, I'm from NBC News, so I ignored it. And then she called me. I said, why are you ignoring me? And I'm like, I don't know. I didn't think you were real. And she goes, no, I'm an intern with NBC News, and she was an Ojibwe woman from Michigan. And so I know some of the story of early childhood. We need to do a story on this. So long story short, NBC News came and did a piece just on early childhood last year. So you can go to their website or YouTube and just look up NBC Indian Boarding School. And they didn't talk about any other place. They came just here and spent 2 days with us. So they interviewed 2 survivors. And immediately I was like, oh, this isn't my story. Who am I going to find who's comfortable to talk on national television? And luckily, 2 really courageous people came forward. So we have a story. They both went there. They spent hours telling their story in the hot August sun, and they just went on and on about what they experienced, what they saw. And it aired. It was kind of surreal. I don't have normal TV, so I had to go to my friend's house and say, let's watch the news. I'm like, what do you mean, let's watch the news? You never come over and watch the news. And like, no, this is going to be different tonight. And then I got the drift. Like, okay. And, they're talking about flooding and what was going on in Afghanistan. And then all of a sudden in Harbor Springs, Michigan. This was nightly news with Lester Holt. And then there's a church. And there's downtown Harbor. So they ran a piece for 2 minutes, scratched the surface. Then they did a follow-up piece, 20 minutes. That's on their website and YouTube. So to get more of that story out there. So I was really pleased that they went a step further and said, no, we need to push this, keep the story going. So the awareness is happening. The work is going on. So if you want to hear stories from the individuals, I encourage you to check that out. But it was tough. It was a tough 2 days. These are people I've known pretty much my whole life. And hear that side of their history. There wasn't a moment, that people weren't having a little bit of a moment of themselves. To turn away and shed a few tears or just kind of lose your breath and get back to work. But that's being human. We all went through that for that 2 days together. So I encourage you to look that up because that's a primary source. It's them. And to this day, you would go downtown Harbor and you'd never know that school existed. There's no marker. There's no sign. So things like tonight really help bring awareness and let people know that this did happen. And it's part of not just Native history, it's part of American history. This isn't something that's in a silo. This is here. And it's a really uncomfortable story. It's a story that I wish I didn't have to tell or relate, but it's a real story. I really truly wish I was up here talking about planting corn or fishing or something like that, but it's reality. And as my elders and my mentors say, you can't always stay with the good stuff or the feel good stuff. You got to get into the real stuff too. So that's why we're here. And this is not pointing the finger at anybody and blaming. Not here to do that. I'm just here to let you know that this happened. There's severe repercussions for this. A lot of kids never made it out of the schools. They're still at the schools. They passed there. And the question is, how did they pass? I want to know. I know diseases went through all populations. Cholera, smallpox, measles, influenza. That doesn't discriminate, as we well know, on race and gender. But what else was happening? If a disease is sweeping through your community, to me, I'd rather be home. Somebody's taking care of me, not in this environment that is devoid of nurture and love and compassion. These are things I weigh out in my mind as a historian, as a human too. How did it happen? Why did it happen? It'll take years. This is something that's going to take a long time to figure out. But the school system, the boarding school system is, in my mind, a bigger picture of the civilization process, policies. They were removing people, Indian removal in the 1800s. And they started removing kids in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They're removing language, they're removing tradition, they're removing all of that, internal Indianness, that internal nativeness in you, extracting it out over time, whether it's through shame or just indoctrination or separation of your families. But at the end of the day, Native people are like, we're trying to learn our language. We're having language classes now. We want to practice those ceremonies that we can learn. We want to dress like our ancestors a little bit more, wearing some designs or, just having that appearance. So at the end of the day, Native people are bouncing back. I always want to end on that note of resiliency and not victimization. Can't ignore the bad, but I'm not going to be defined by the bad. I have immense respect for the people who went through that experience and made it out, and had families and kept the generations going. but I also have immense respect for the people who didn't make it out. And I've read a lot of newspaper articles about runaways. Kids just trying to get back home. 8, 9, 5. Sometimes they don't make it. They drown in a lake, they freeze to death, starve, or just not found. And it really hit home where I found this one newspaper article from 1942. 2 young boys, 13. They ran away in February, Harbor Springs. And they were trying to get back to Munising, the UP. It's a long ways. This is before the bridge was even built. So they're willing to cross the ice, walk over 100 miles in freezing temperatures to get home. And one of them didn't make it. He died just outside of Cross Village where I grew up. I seen the family name. I know the family. Just the whole story is in this article. They stopped at their aunt's house, and the aunt says, "You got to go back. You're not going to make it." They were so determined to get home. They stayed a few hours and got something to eat, and then they continued on, and they made it about 5 miles north of Cross Village, a place called Sturgeon Bay. Very iconic beach, part of Wilderness State Park. One of them passed there. He froze to death, and the other one went back to Cross Village and got authorities. So what would drive 2 boys to do this? I can't imagine. They didn't have the gear. They didn't have snowmobiles. They were walking in a wool coat and shoes to get home. So that's part of the story. And it's tough. It's tough, knowing that and, being in these areas. Like I live in Harbor Springs now, and I have 2 very active dogs. One's 1 and the other's 2, so they're on fire all the time, and they need walks like 10 times a day. And so I'm walking them constantly, and we kind of skirt around. We stay away from the school. So we'll go down this way. Let's bypass that. And I know for a fact that there's kids around that school buried. They've been found before. We know that there's children around Holy Childhood. So let's pay my respects in that way too. Particularly like going in places like that. And I was fortunate enough, as I just started my job in 2006, this was right before Holy Childhood was torn down, and so I was like, this is like a really historic moment. I have to, it's like the last walkthrough of the school. So I went there, and just 2 ears, 2 eyes, watch and learn. All these people who went to the school. It was really powerful. Some people they wouldn't even go in. They stopped at the front door. It was just, so you have to remove yourself for a minute and then go back in. So I went in, and there was people who were talking and just reliving their experiences. Then they were very vocal about it, which I was really glad. Some people were there catching interviews from Michigan Public Radio and a couple other news sources. So that was really cool that they were there capturing in the moment these people going through, and they haven't been in the school for 40 years or something. And some people won't talk, and I respect that, of course. And then there were certain areas in the school where people all were like, "No, this isn't the place I want to be." Let's go through. That was the last time they did a walkthrough, and they tore a school down a year later. And it was a mixed bag. It was people who were saying, keep it up because it will remind everyone what happened. You can't deny the visual. And I was like, yeah, keep it up. As a historian, like, yeah, you got to keep this up. And then the next person, no, you have to tear it down because it reminds us of what happened. It's a trigger. I wouldn't want to, see something that caused me pain. So yeah, tear it. So I was like, I was back and forth, and it was so complicated. But at the end of the day, the school was torn down. 2007. So, but the legacy is definitely there. Today, there's a lot of individuals who are looking at healing and awareness. And if you see individuals gathered around Native people and non-Native, if they're wearing orange, that's become the color of boarding school awareness. So you'll see large gatherings and all the Native people are wearing orange hoodie, orange t-shirt, whatever. They're remembering the school and the kids who went to the school. So it's become, try not to wear orange unless, it's time and place. Not that I have a bunch of orange clothes anyway, but I save them for when I really need them. And people are coming forward and they're sharing. So it's happening. It's really humbling to be in that space with those individuals. If you ever have the opportunity, I encourage you to engage in that space if you feel comfortable, to listen, and just to know that it was real. And it wasn't one or two, it was 360 plus. It's part of a system. It was put in place from the president, Congress, senators, everybody wanted us to be non-Native. Luckily, that failed to some degree. We're still Native. I pride myself in trying to learn my language, and I would say I'm a pagan. I'm trying to learn my old ways, my ceremonies, and the things that my ancestors did. I wouldn't be able to do that if it wasn't for that generation going through that. So I have an immense amount of respect for those individuals. And in the fall time, we have something called the Ghost Supper. It's an old pagan tradition where we burn food for our ancestors. And I learned that it goes beyond your immediate family. It's all the Anishinaabe people. And in my line of work, I don't do it anymore, but I used to. It's called repatriation, where we would go and get remains of individuals from museums and have them returned, and we rebury them. So I always think about that, that there's all these people who are waiting to come back home, whether they're in a museum or they're in an unmarked grave. They need to come back home. So we think about them in these ghost suppers as fall time comes along. So it's gone beyond just my grandma, my uncle, my dad, and everybody else. It's all those people that, the elder said, two ears, two eyes, you're way beyond you, beyond what's in front of you. You got to think in those terms. So with that, I want to say miigwech. That's thank you in our language of Anishinaabe, but as one elder told me, and I have much respect for this individual. He's very blunt, so no time to mess around. Anyway, he's like, thank you is one translation. I'm going to get a teaching here in a minute. He goes, but it's a little more than that. I'm grateful for all that you've given me. That resonates with me. That's something to think about. Not saying you gotta, change all this and that, but something to think about. And it really stuck. That term, I'm grateful for all you've given me. You give me your time, your space, and this opportunity to share. I'm really grateful for that. I can have all the knowledge and information in the world, but if you're not out there sharing it and using it, what good is it? I don't know how this information is going to go beyond this room, who's going to be affected, but that's just trusting in the process. You may talk to somebody and they're going to talk to somebody, and then you're going to educate somebody. It just goes from there. And I'll end this with one quick story about an exhibit that was at the Denos right here locally last year about Indian boarding schools. And there's a traveling exhibit from the Heard Museum, Arizona, and really, really well done exhibit, but it didn't have anything on Michigan. So the Denos contacted me and said, hey, can we throw something together like real fast because this exhibit's here. We have to have something about Michigan. And I was like, yeah, how long we got? I was like, about a month. I'm like, oh, okay, let's get cracking. So we put something together I thought pretty good in a month. But it wasn't good enough. We had to make it better. We did. We focused even more on Michigan. focused on these schools. And right at the tail end of the exhibit, there were some schools, I think from Northport and Leland. They were doing some tours of it, and I came down and gave a talk. And we did my talk, but also had the kids go through the exhibit and let them experience it, feel it. There was one young Odawa girl. She was very quiet, very thoughtful. She was just kind of in this one piece of the exhibit. I didn't want to bother her, she's doing something, processing, thinking, feeling, all the above. But I was kind of drawn to her. All these other kids were kind of like, not all of them, but they're being kids, and she was just like locked into this one thing. So I just started inching towards her. Finally, I was about a couple feet from her. She knew, of course. And she just looked over and she said, "My dad went to that school." And everything fell in place. This is why we do this stuff. And she told me a little bit, not much. He goes, "My dad went and he told me some things, and I understand, things. Don't tell me I don't want to know anymore. I don't need to know anymore." But the fact that she could relate and she was seeing the bigger picture and very personal to her, it made all that work just worthwhile. To just touch with that little, not little girl, she was a teenager. So she went home and told her family, I'm sure, that this was going on. She wanted to listen to that, but she knew more than we did, without a doubt. So the work's happening. It's going on as we speak. You don't know who the work's going to be through, whether it's a 14-year-old girl or a 7-year-old elder. We're all in this together. So I say miigwech again for having the opportunity to come down and share. And I can try to answer some questions. I feel very comfortable saying I don't know, but I can give it a shot. I think there's going to be a microphone floating around.
I'm wondering if there was oversight from the Catholic Church, or were the people that ran the school just left on their own to do whatever they wanted to do?
I can't speak on behalf of any other school, but only what I've known about Holy Childhood. And that the Sisters of Notre Dame were there to the very end. The Franciscans were there as well. Personally, I haven't had any interaction with the Catholic Church. We requested information. I haven't got back to us. So
who were the savages, the students or the staff?
well, I would never say a student's a savage. Kids are kids. But I would say it was a pretty savage system.
The Museum of Ojibwa Culture in St. Ignace has done an outstanding study, and they have testimonials from people who were there, pictures. So anybody who goes there, quiet yourself to go in there, because it is experienced by when you look at the children and look at the pictures and the faces of those beautiful children. It is a moment of quiet, and my wife and I had the privilege of talking to the elders, some of which who went there, and I say go there, and go there quietly, be prepared to listen.
I was curious as to whether, you said there were graves at the school. Are there plans to figure out how to preserve that land and before some development gets a hold of it and builds condos in?
So it's already been developed. They, the church built a community center where the school once stood. And I don't know if they found graves when they did that, but there's been multiple discoveries at Holy Childhood over the last 20 years.
I want to thank you, first of all, for holding your mic so we could hear you so clearly. Did they go home on weekends? Did they go home for the summer? Would not that get them back to their language? Do you know how long they stayed at the?
It depended on the students. Some stayed there year-round for years. Some went home on weekends. Some went home for the summer. Some didn't. It just depends. All of the above.
And I'm also, the two other things that the negative things are so much there. I have a daughter that for the last 25 years has lived in the bush of Alaska, related mostly to cricket and Athabascans. And and she speaks well of what they learned at the school. So I mean, there is that positive element. And then when I heard of all these huge numbers of deaths, but then you said chickenpox and the likes of that, which are cause a lot of children's deaths. This eases but doesn't end the burden. Thank you.
In the movie Indian Horse, have you seen that movie? It's
Uh,
about the young man who was taken and put into the school and then he grows up with hot pants and sort of out.
mhm.
I'm just wondering if that is a reasonable depiction.
I haven't watched the movie yet. As Lucy was stating earlier about getting burned out, I get burned out here and there, and reading this stuff and listening to interviews and all day at work. Sometimes I get home, I don't want to do it. I got to wait and build up. But there's always that narrative out there of the exception. I can't speak to Indian Horse. I don't want to, speak to that because I haven't seen it. But I've had conversations with individuals about Jim Thorpe. That Jim Thorpe went to the Carlisle School, exceptional. He's the 1%er. He's this exceptional, world-class Olympic athlete, football star. And obviously, he wouldn't have been able to do that if he didn't go to Carlisle. So there's always that story. But at the same time, there's 100 kids that are being devastated at these schools. So I'll have to watch it. There's been more story in cinema about boarding schools coming out in the last, I'd say, 10 years. Another movie a friend recommended, it's called Rabbit Proof Fence. And that's about Australia. It's the same system. They're taking kids and putting them in these schools. So I'll get there. I just gotta have a moment, of fortitude, I guess, to watch these things.
Don't watch it on a rainy day.
All right.
It's devastating.
Was there, with this whole system of 360 schools, did they have any kind of pecking order of these schools? Like, Carlisle was known as, with Pop Warner, as a big football school. So was there any kind of an academic kind of, elite school system that, the whites were trying to move, exceptional children through, or was there anything like that?
I would say overall, no. I think overall the exception was Carlisle. that, it had the really well-known sports program. It was run by, this really well-known Army individual. It had the prestige, it had the funding, and kids from all over the country went to Carlisle, from Alaska to Florida. So it had that pedigree in terms of schools. But from my research, most of the schools were geared towards basic arithmetic and math. And a lot of the education was towards labor. Carpenters, cobblers, very gender split. The women were learning the husbandry skills of sewing and cooking and cleaning. They weren't gearing these kids to be lawyers and doctors.
Did you find, with regard to the social fabric of families, when they would come into a home and take kids, would those kids typically end up going to the same school, or was there situations where kids would be sent? Oh, okay.
We have one situation from our community up north where one family from Cross Village had 4 of their kids go to 4 different schools. And I have no idea how that happened. I just know because we have letters that they were sending back and forth. And one was local at Harbor Springs, one was at Mount Pleasant, one was out in Nebraska. And the one seemed to excel. He went into the Army and was in World War II and made it back alive. So a lot of these kids who went to these schools actually transitioned into the military. So, it just seemed like a natural next step for them. But some didn't, some came out and they couldn't. It's just hard to talk about because I didn't experience trauma at the school. But you see people who did, or you read about it, or, hear these stories of these really, really deeply traumatic, abusive environments for years on end. And then they get out of the schools, nobody's there to fix them. And so they just go right back into the community, and you see these cycles of trauma and abuse play out, whether it's substance abuse or physical abuse. This is just kind of perpetuated all throughout our communities for generations. So now we're trying to get to a point of like stopping trauma. We don't have to carry that from generation to generation. And personally growing up and seeing, it's taken decades. I grew up with these individuals, and some of them have like the most awful substance abuse growing up. And they're feeding into this, stereotype of the drunk Indian or lazy Indian. And as you're 12, 13, you're thinking, why is that? This person's always inebriated, or, come to find out they went to the boarding school. Who knows what they saw or experienced? They're just dealing with it the best they can. But growing up in these, real isolated communities, and they're passing judgments saying, "Oh, it's just a drunk Indian. They're always drunk." That's a stereotype I grew up with, is the drunk Indian, lazy Indian. But now it's like the stereotype is flipped. It's like, oh, you get all the money from the casino. I'm like, no, I don't get any money from the casino. I work pretty hard. So it's like, but there's this bias still. But it's so individual. That's why, and I really tread lightly about even sharing stories that I've heard from other people, because that's their story.
So I'm really curious about what we have read around Peter Doherty coming to establish a school in the mission at church. And there's record that there was a school in operation once they moved from Old Mission to Amina. Mm-hmm. But that's not listed as one of the boarding schools. And so I'm curious if you know, or what has been uncovered or researched, or maybe not and needs yet to happen, about the school associated with Peter Doherty's mission in this county particularly, and or where would we go to begin that kind of research?
Well, just go to your local county records, local libraries. There's probably going to be stuff at National Archives, State Archives. It's all over the place. But I don't want to put my foot in my mouth because I don't know much about the Doherty mission. I know it existed. It would have been a mission school. It would have been a federal boarding school at that time. So it's probably similar to like at Holy Childhood during that time period, where it was a joint community endeavor. But there needs to be context to this. this is the time of removal. That the federal government is literally sweeping through what they call the Old Northwest, east of the Mississippi, and removing natives out to Oklahoma, Kansas, sometimes by force. So how are you going to avoid the Army coming in? You start building churches, you start going to these schools, you start showing that you're quote unquote becoming civilized. I think that has to be taken into context with this time period. And removal was happening in Michigan. There was Potawatomi being removed by force from near St. Joseph and Kalamazoo, Battle Creek. Like the Army was literally hunting people down and capturing them and sending them out west. And it was coming north. Like I said, the Odawa were slated for removal in 1838. It was that dire of a situation. So that's all got to be taken into account in this time period.
And with that context and what is maybe yet to be discovered about the Doherty mission and what you've shared about Holy Childhood tonight, I listened to Leora from Marquette speak about her work around the boarding schools as well, and one of the things that she said was we're still within the Indigenous community figuring out what we need to reckon with what repair looks like. And so I recognize that this question may not have an answer yet, but I also want to give space for it if there is something there that you want to share, which is what is the role of the Catholic Church in Harbor Springs? What is the role of the Presbyterian Church here to begin to work toward repair? Is it putting a marker up? Is it holding, what are the things? There are many, I imagine, and layers and generations of that. But from where you stand today and the work that is unfolding today, what feels like the next step for the role of these churches in this work?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, conversation, acknowledgement. First, it's such a complex, because you're going back hundreds of years, multiple generations. I would just start with a conversation, an honest, open conversation that isn't going to be a one-time conversation, that you have the space to do this acceptance of awareness that this did happen. And also hearing the people who went there, giving them the space and the dignity and respect of sharing their stories and their experiences, that needs to happen. So there's this degree of healing, there's this degree of awareness. It's just this immense process that needs to take place. It has so many moving parts to it. It's like, which moving part do you start with? Which church do you start with? What school do you start with? What family do you start with? What generation? What do you want to focus on first? The burials, the loss of language, or all these things that are tied into the school. So this will be fleshed out over time, though. I think it's gonna take some real reckoning at times, some real soul searching on both parts. Even just for myself personally, is reading these stories and wanting to shut the book. There's so many other things to be doing, other things to be researching, other projects to be focused on. It's just so easy to, not today, but I did that for a long time. And can't do that anymore. Like I said, we had a situation years ago where they found burials at the school. That was part of their recovery. And that's something you don't move away from easily. It's like it's ingrained in you. They call you up and say, we have something that needs to be taken care of here. So we went down there, we took care of it. Just all these kids. So ignore that. It happened for a reason. I wish it didn't happen. I wish I weren't there. I wish they would have made it back home or grew up to be people of career and success, but they're there. It's nonsense. We have to address it, to take care of it. So in my mind, that's one of the first steps. Where are the kids at? They're all over. Mount Pleasant, Harbor Springs, Carlisle. Not just the Odawa, it's all of these tribes. This is all of us. So I hyper focus on the Odawa because that's who I am, who I'm from, but then I gotta be mindful. What if I find a record that pertains to another tribe? I wanna share that with that tribe. Say, hey, you had a kid here, or I stumbled across this map, or whatever. Maybe you can use this. So it's just, we're in this together in a certain sense. Hopefully, somebody would have that same type of respect for us. Say, hey, I found this. And it happens. I mean, we had a, totally unrelated to boarding schools, but a colleague in Wisconsin called me up and said that this a sister, she was part of a Catholic order, and she was going through and cleaning out their archives, and they found this photo album that was all in birch bark. It had all this quill work, really ornate. Inside it said Cross Village. And she said, I know somebody from Cross Village. And he called me up, and I drove over there immediately. So we do have each other in mind like that. There's this Indian country, Indian world is really small. We're 1% of the population, that's it. So you're gonna run into somebody you know, or your mom knew, or your cousin. It's just inevitable all the time. So, and everybody's talking too, and it's like, hey, so-and-so has this, or do you talk to so-and-so? So we're mindful of that.
I just have a strong urge for us to remind each other that, Eric, we've been talking about trauma, and just a child being removed from their home is a trauma. And a child being separated from their siblings is a trauma, regardless of what happened at the school afterwards. So we need to be mindful of that as well. And my other question for you is that there's a federal initiative for investigations of the schools. Do you have any idea of a time plan?
Not right away. I know they put it out last year, and again, I should know this better. I wish I did, but I believe they're looking at putting what they want to look at first. Where are the schools? How many? Try to get rosters, possible burial locations. I think the first phase is just this massive gathering, which will take years and years, because some of these schools are operated by this denomination, that denomination, or the feds. Some of these schools are only in operation for like 10 years, 5 years, 50 years. Records burn, they go up in flames, or they just disappear, or the school gets torn down and nobody remembers where it is. So it's like all this missing history that has to be accounted for at some point. But then, also recognizing of the survivors, and not just looking at this as this moment in time, but yeah, we're gonna find this church or this school and that's it. But also recognizing that there's literally thousands of people who went to these schools are still living with us today. And that's can't be this own little thing to be pushed aside. You have to account for that. So it's kind of, yeah, boom. It's but it's so good it's happening. And not being in this little inner circle of this tight knit native community. And, oh, that's a school, and that's where bad things happen. It's like, how come more people don't know about this? But then getting older, and one of my really good friends I graduated with, I'm still in contact with him and his parents to this day. And I didn't know this till like 5 years ago, but his dad went as a day student as a white kid. And like, I didn't know this, Jerry. He goes, well, you never asked, so why would you know? I'm like, so tell me. He goes, yeah, it was a Catholic school. It's rough for everybody. Because the Indians always had it rough across the board, no matter what. And he told this one story about these two brothers who are from the UP, and they would try to run away all the time, wanting to go back home. This is in I'll say the 50s. And Jerry he could go home at night. He went home and like a normal student. But these two native boys, Ojibwe boys, they were boarders. They were there for the long run, and they'd always run, always trying to get back home. They would catch him. They'd lock him in a room on the 3rd floor. And Jerry made friends with these two guys, and throughout the course of the day, he would hide food, half a cookie, part of a sandwich, a banana, from his own food or other kids' food. And as he was running out to go home, those two boys would stick their head out the window and say, "Hey, Jerry, what do you got today?" He would just throw up whatever food he could scrounge. So it's not, I would have never guessed that from Jerry. I never heard that story from anybody else, but it was just this real moving piece about humanity, really. He was this young boy, probably 9, 10, 11, but he seen what was going on. He knew it wasn't right. He was trying to help as best as he could. And Jerry was always a cool guy. I always loved Jerry, still do. I was like, "Hey, you've always been a nice guy." He's like, "Well, I try." But for him to, he would have got beat or, reprimanded if he got caught. But he still did that every day. He said he'd throw it up, and the kids would catch it and go back in, and that was their meal for the day. So that's the type of stuff we need to start pulling out of communities too. Not just the native communities, the non-native. We're part of this. We're going to see a lot of information, I think, coming out when we start to interact. Because they're going to know things that other people just don't know. So can't overlook that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you all help me by saying miigwech?
Thank you.
We are grateful for what you have given us. And we're just going to take about 5 minutes to just close with one quick announcement. And we've heard a lot tonight, and I invite you to just sit for a couple more minutes with what has landed in this room and in your body in this time. And we'll close with a quick prayer. So just about 5 more minutes. So the announcement I want to offer is that this is really what the Racial Justice Working Team here sees as the beginning to this conversation and this work, right? Let's dive deep in the learning together, and then let's continue to be in conversation about what those next steps are going to be for this conversation. And so if you want to come to the next meeting, that would be a great place to start, is to come to the Racial Justice Working Group meeting. I should have pulled it up on my phone, which I don't have in my pocket. If someone on the team can glance at a calendar and tell me the date and time, we can repeat that in a moment. You can be sure that you get an email about that by putting your name on the clipboard in the back, and we'll add you to the Racial Justice Working Team list, and we'll always send meeting reminders out that way as well. So either sign up in the back or come to the next meeting. Do you have the date? Yeah. This coming Monday at 6:30, and it is via Zoom. We may move back to in-person here soon, but we have still been meeting Zoom so far. So we invite you to join us for that conversation. Whether or not you're able to come to that team meeting, I am sure there will continue to be gatherings and opportunities to engage in action and continued learning and research around all of this. So stay tuned for what is yet to come. I'd like to close with part of a song that is written by our Native Daughters, which is a collective of Black and Indigenous artists that we actually did a whole worship service around a couple months ago at Nexus. And this song is called "The Moon Meets the Sun." And it is these women who wrote these songs. This particular song is a story about the resilience of Black and Indigenous folks who have been through so much and yet are here and are alive and are beautiful and strong and creative and resilient. And so I invite you to sit with the words of this music for a few minutes, and we'll close with a prayer.
When the day is done, the moon meets the sun, we'll be dancing trespass. We'll survive this. You can't stop us and we're dancing. When the day is done, the moon meets the sun, we'll be dancing. When the day is done, the moon meets the sun, we'll be dancing.
I could thank you all again for the gift of your presence here. As I was searching for something to close in prayer, I was pondering, why is it that I knew so little about all of this myself? And it struck me that maybe some of it was kept secret for reasons. And then I came upon a prayer by Walter Brueggemann, Professor Emeritus, Presbyterian Seminary, in this book called Awed to Heaven, Rooted in Earth, and it's entitled A People with Many Secrets. You are the God from whom no secret can be hid, and we are a people with many secrets that we want to tell for the sake of our lives, that we dare not tell because they are deep and painful. But they are our secrets, and they count for much. They are our truth, rooted deep in our lives. You are the God of all truth, and now we bid you heed our truth, about which we will not bear false witness. The truth of grief unresolved, the truth of pain unacknowledged, the truth of fear too childlike, the truth of hate as powerful as it is deep, the truth of being taken advantage of and being used and manipulated and slandered. We trust the great truth of your wondrous love, but we will not sit still for it until you hear us. Our truth, heard by you, will make us free. So be the God of all truth, even ours, we pray in the name of Jesus, who is your best kept secret of hurt. Amen.